Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight as we continue to celebrate the best we could do, our fall book club choice for the big read. Tonight's program, we have Dr. Jason Chang, and he's going to be presenting to us When the Past Becomes the Future, Teaching the History of Asian America. All yours, Dr. Chang.
Sarah, thank you for the invitation and for this chance to participate in your library's public programming. This is really fantastic to be able to have an extended conversation about this text more than I think so often we kind of come in, read something and digest it and then move on to something else. And this is certainly one of those texts that once you read it, you find things that you missed the first time around, and it continually opens up new things for me. So it's also such a beautiful book, and learning tool. So I'm really grateful for the chance to chat with y'all. So my plan for this evening is to share a bit about the work that we've been doing to teach Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in Connecticut schools. And then to kind of, I thought it might be useful to put Thibui's book in a kind of larger historical context of Asian American history. And so I'm gonna kind of, skim through about 150 years of Asian American history, but I wanted to do it in a kind of structured way so that you can follow a couple different important threads. One of which is the evolution of immigration laws, which have shaped the integration and the public image of Asian immigrants in the United States. And the next is I wanted to follow a different but related thread that looks at US wars and imperialism. And that oftentimes we don't think of those two things as related, but it's so clearly integral to Thibui's story and her family's experience as Vietnamese refugees, that this book acts as an important kind of intellectual bridge for thinking about not only social history, but political history and legal history. And so that's kind of my goal. I'd like to end by sharing a little bit of my thoughts on the book and then share an exercise that I have done with my students based on Thibui's work. And then I want to turn to your questions and your thoughts about the book. Would love to hear the things that you found fascinating and intriguing, and then we can follow the conversation there. So one of the things that really draws me to this work is that right now this is an important time to delve into Asian American studies in Connecticut, because earlier this year, we started a campaign to bring Asian American Pacific Islander studies to public schools. And we were fortunate enough to pass that legislation. And so this, in combination with several other curriculum, are now a part of the State Department of Education's charge to build a model K-8 curriculum. And so we're very excited about this. It really, is kind of first of its kind in public schools, and to think about the way that this curriculum can begin to correct the glaring absence of Asian Americans in our public education. So, one of the things that we've done is to use this Big Reads program as an opportunity to share this text with other high schools. While our model curriculum is K-8, we know that this work can be done in high schools as well. So, I'm a professor at UConn. I also direct the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. And one of the things that we started there was an activist in residence program. And so this year, Jen Jennifer Hekila Diaz from New Haven is our activist in residence, and she's helping run our public school extension program to bring the best we could do to almost 24 high school classrooms around the state. So this is really exciting work. We're going to learn a lot from this experience and hope to just keep this this trend going. And these experiences will ultimately inform how the state builds out this K-8 curriculum by adjusting and building new social studies standards for the elementary and middle schools. So we're really excited to see what that will look like, and then to begin the work of training teachers and building out new resources. So I want to shift gears now to kind of wear my history hat, because one way to understand Thibui's book is as an act of resistance, or as an act of claiming a certain truth that isn't often recognized in the public sphere. Or if you imagine Southeast Asian refugees, her story isn't often the first that comes to mind, right? And so in this kind of act, this very public act of telling the story and claiming a certain truth is, there is a long history of Asian Americans doing that. So in those experiences and those struggles, those truth claims are always, structured by the racialized exclusion of Asians and the conditions of their integration. So, one way to understand that is that there are kind of different forms of belonging, right? There's legal belonging, there's economic belonging, cultural belonging. And, one of the things I find so inspiring about work like Thibui's and The Best We Could Do is if, the arts provide a role of representing, all three of those kinds of belonging, but as well as providing a kind of, a kind of political language to talk about how they all work together, right? How legal belonging contributes to economic belonging, and how that can inform, cultural belonging too. So, one of the parables of Asian American history that kind of sets some of these terms for belonging is, in the 19th century, when Asian indentured workers from China and South Asia became used as replacements for emancipated enslaved Africans in Caribbean colonies and in the Americas. And so this was, called the coolie trade, because it was about the importation of these indentured workers. And one of the truths of that migration of indentured workers was that these Asian workers were both desired and disposable, and that kind of duality of their experience really shaped a lot of how Asians were treated after that. So when we think about the kind of the origins of Asian exclusion, I often point to 1862 Act to prohibit the coolie trade, and this was something passed by President Lincoln during during the period of the Civil War, right? So so this is a period where we see that the exclusion of Asians was meant to also be an anti-slavery law, because of the idea that Asians were a kind of enslaved race already. And that led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's where we see the first racial bars to naturalization and immigration in the United States. And because of that bar, it inspired many forms of legal challenges to this, some of which were successful. Wong Kim Ark was someone who challenged the United States on this claim and won birthright citizenship. And this is something that now all people born in the United States have now, thanks to his challenge to those exclusion acts. With that, because it's so focused on immigration and naturalization, we'd have to now turn to the experiences of the second and third generations that happen once we get to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, right? And so for that, I point to the 1924 Immigration and Nationality Act, which really sets up a quota system for the United States immigration, and which basically gives quotas only to Europeans, and Northern Europeans at that. And so in that 1924 law, what it also did was it established other kinds of criteria that led to barring certain people from owning land, and really creating more challenges for that second and third generation. So it wasn't just because of the exclusion, but then carrying that over into a deeply segregated United States. Then we have to turn to World War II and civil rights era, and for that, one of the characteristics of challenge was that many Asian Americans decided to fight in the war for different reasons. For instance, Korean Americans wanted to fight in order to help free Korea from Japanese occupation, right? So many Filipinos, became enlisted in order to fight for the liberation of the Philippines from Japanese occupation as well. So, we have many different reasons for that integration, and through military service, some did get recognized, others didn't, right? So still experiencing many of those boundaries, some of those racial boundaries. Civil rights era is another distinctive period where Asian Americans are also present. They're also fighting for the reversal of these racial bars and ongoing de facto segregation, even if there wasn't de jure segregation, that they were still being discriminated against in housing, in schooling, and many other areas that folks might be familiar with. And ultimately, what really turns the tide for immigration at this period is the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, and this is a law which dismantles the 1924 quota system, and says, we're not going to abide by this, what was then referred to as a racist quota system, right? But is instead going to be a merit-based system. And so there's still, ways that that racism creeps into those designations, but nevertheless, they were kind of focused on, how much capital do you have? How much money do you have in the bank? Do you have a sponsor? Do you have a employer sponsorship, or other witnesses who can attest to your character? And these were various, pieces of the puzzle that helped to shape a new era of immigration, which really caught the framers of the law off guard. This law was intended to welcome Eastern Europeans who are fleeing communism, and what eventually happened was that this became the keynote, the keystone, piece of legislation that provided the legal pathway for Asian and Latino immigrants to come to the United States. And in this Cold War period, we have to understand that geopolitical struggles in the Cold War also continued to shape how people were migrating, and that these wars were incredibly disruptive, displacing millions of people. Right. So we see now a turn in immigration law in 1975 with the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act. Right. Now, this is something which Steve Bui's story is very, very intimately, shaped by. But this is also an important, law which provided the financial and administrative or bureaucratic, techniques and tools for extracting people from one country, bringing them into another, and setting the conditions for their arrival. right? Now, one of the things that we see in the patterns after this is that the United States and a post 1965 reality is that the United States begins to get the majority of its immigrants from places where it sends foreign investment and where it sends bombs. And those two things began to shape how people came to the United States. And so in this period, we think of if we can think of various groups that kind of make that up, those are refugees and tech workers, right? So we can see that this the immigration of Asian scientists, computer engineers, all of these are a part of this a larger political definition of the immigration system and its laws, as well as economic transformations, right? So what we see, though, happening in the 1990s is a kind of backlash against much of this new foreign-born population, whether from displacement from war or displacement from foreign investment by the United States. And so in 1996, we see the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. This was passed during the Clinton administration, and sets up a criminalization of civil immigration infractions, right? So this is immigration law is a civil matter, right? It's like a marriage certificate is civil law, right? So immigration law is also a civil form, but the what is referred to as IRA, this law in 1996 criminalized civil infractions, right? So it gave it jail time, fines, and bars from future entry. And so this was a really it reflected a backlash against what many kind of referred to as a sort of refugee fatigue, but then also a backlash against those workers who were highly educated workers who were coming in after 1965. And through the behest of other corporations who were recruiting them. And so that kind of cultural backlash really brings us into the 20th century. So now that I've kind of laid out this legal history, really this is flying at light speed through this history. But I thought it would be also interesting to pair that with a brief history of U.S. wars of imperialism, to kind of pair those, to understand how those the context of those immigration changes are also a part of a larger kind of system of warfare, a practice of warfare here in the United States. So one of the first expeditions or forms of imperial practice by the United States in Asia goes all the way back to the 1830s. In 1832, the United States sends its navy to Sumatra, to Kuala Batu, to try to secure the rights to trade pepper, which might not sound that like a big deal, but the commodity was very valuable, and preserving gaining the rights to trading that led to many other kinds of interests of the United States in securing those kinds of access. This we see again in the 1840s with the Opium Wars. The U.S. participates in that too, to allow for the importation of goods from the American West. Next, we would turn to the Spanish-American War, 1898. And here we see the United States acquiring Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, and Samoa, and leading to a 30-year occupation of the Philippines. While this is happening, we also see in 1917, or in the first part of the 20th century, we see World War I, which many people don't really think of as having a kind of Asian or Pacific, dimension to it. But this is where we see the beginning of, geopolitical competition between the United States and Japan over control over the Pacific. Right. So, and that, of course, the sequel to that story is World War II. And, we have to point out underscore the atomic bombing and occupation of Japan from that period. The experience of World War II establishes a new kind of motivation for the United States to expand a global military presence. And this is where we begin to see the growth in military bases as outposts to manage various geopolitical conflicts. And we see this again play out with the Cold War, right? So the Korean War in 1950, and also following Vietnam, their moves for decolonization and independence, 1955, leading to again the participation of the United States in Vietnam. And here, we see that this is because the Vietnam War was such an enormous undertaking and such a dramatic, and colossal failure, it often takes our attention away from other areas in which the United States was active at the same time. For instance, in South Asia with Pakistan. And so this was an area where the United States was funding, and supplying West Pakistan with military equipment and arming them in order to favor that regime, but also to buy the goodwill of the Pakistani government in order to help them get in touch with to make contact with China. Ultimately, Nixon does, go to China, and so that power play paid off for them. But at the same time, that the military buildup of West Pakistan led to a very bloody and brutal civil war in East Pakistan, which led to Bangladeshi independence ultimately. And so, when we think of that period, 1970s, really that, this is an area of conflict that is really much broader than Southeast Asia. But through that story, we can understand the outlines of these other lesser known areas, which also produce their own, displaced refugee populations, right? So carrying forward, we see, other forms of U.S. intervention in, say, like the Gulf War in 1991, which produced again another stream of refugees, many of which, ended up being resettled in Michigan, where I'm originally from Indiana. And so, growing up and seeing news about Iraqi refugees coming to Michigan was quite a shock, but only because I didn't know the history, right? And so when we begin to understand these things, those decisions and their presence begins to make a lot more sense. Carrying forward again, we see that the war on terror is that next frontier. And most recently we see the conclusion of the military occupation of Afghanistan, and the pullout from Iraq, and that brings us to the present. And it's the combination of these legal and military histories that I think help to demonstrate the depth of significance of how the Asian American experience can be shaped by those ideas of being desired as allies, as wartime allies, as people who are in need of rescue, but ultimately who are disposable when the needs of the United States shift. And we can see that in the backlash against the immigrants. We can see that in the lack of support for them as refugees, and then also the continued practice of warfare in Asia. So those are some things that I think if you could hold those two streams of thought together, as you think about Thibault's work, it makes a much more complicated picture that where she's bringing forward a kind of cultural understanding of what those histories are like from the inside. Let's see. So, one of the things I ask my tell my students is that this book really cuts through so many layers of history, but it offers a window into the experience of one family. And she makes really conscious choices to tell the story which makes sense for her family, right? That doesn't fit into the frames of understanding shaped by US mainstream conceptions of Southeast Asian refugees or Asian Americans in general. So I really appreciate the ways that she starts her story as a family conversation, and ends up going all the way, tracing the experience of warfare in her family all the way back to French occupation, right? And seeing this long unraveling of violence, of transformation, of migration, is such a tender, and an important story that is, reveals a lot for us. And I think it's an important piece to understanding that those experiences are shaped by trauma. And when historical experience is shaped by trauma, that's often shrouded in silence, right? So the thing that feels really special about this book is that the bravery and courage that T went through to make this book is in some ways a gift to an entire generation, right? Who has maybe felt that they couldn't share their story, or maybe talking to their parents in this similar fashion was a challenge or seemed impossible to them. So I took that as inspiration, and what I did was I took a couple pages from T's work and shared them with my students as a template for asking them some of the questions that seemed to kind of structure the narrative for the best we could do. And so I asked them to write a script for themselves and then illustrate it using some of the pages that T did, that really kind of stood out to me as important kind of moments. And so I asked them to write a script, and it goes something like this. I asked them to write the first sentence as I am, and then you say that child of, the daughter, the son, that I am the child of, and then name your parents. If you don't know your parents, like if you're adopted or you don't have a relationship with them, then you're the prior generation, or who are your elders. And then to ask them to finish the next sentence, I remember, and then a memory of them, right, which grounds them in your past, right? And then I asked them to write the sentence they struggled with, to ask them to consider what kinds of things did their parents or their elders struggle with. What were some of the things that were challenges for them? I think it's a really important, strategy for storytelling for T to, ask her, really, think about the things that shaped her parents' choices. So I wanted to reflect that too. I think that's a really powerful line of questioning. And then I asked them to think of a question that they've never asked their parents. They've never verbalized to them. Write that question down. And then I had them speculate on how they might respond. How would they respond to that question? And then, as T does, to inquire why would they respond that way? What are the things in their life that have historically shaped them or given, made that answer seem rational? And then finally, to ask them to think of a wish that their parents might say to them, but maybe have never said out loud. What do you think your parents or your elders would wish for you? and then write that down. And so first I'll share the pages that I drew from in T's work, and then I'll show you an example of one of my students. And then we can open it up and have a bigger conversation. So let's see. So the first one appears here, and it looks like this. I'll just hold it up for the camera. I don't have a good scan of it. So can you see that one? So it's her with her eyes open and then with her eyes closed. And then here, really loved this page where it shows a neighborhood split between the two panels. And then up here, over here, a question embedded in that image of her neighborhood. Then lastly, really love this page where it shows her, she's depicted a conversation, or a scene where she's sitting with her father as a child, and then sitting with her father as a child. Oh, how do I get that? There you go. And then sitting with her father as adults, right? And I thought that was such a powerful way of illustrating that way of thinking about how your parents' life was shaped, and the conversation that two children might have, given their different realities. So here, I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see an example of what this looks like. Okay, can y'all see that? Yeah, okay, great. So this one here states, I am the child of Miri Park and Jim Chul Kim. I remember the 2-hour car drives to Portland, Maine. They struggled with losing family to health issues. Then in this picture of her childhood house, she writes, what were all the reasons why you left Korea? And then this is her response here. You imagined her father saying, our father wanted a better life for all of us. And her mother, my father, got a visa as a doctor to go to Africa. And then why did they respond that way? He was a humanist and disagreed with the government and the patriarchal society in Korea and wanted to move us away. As a doctor, he wanted to help those who didn't have the same access to healthcare. He was a smart, caring man who wanted to touch the lives of many people. And then what wish would she suspect parents would have for her? Find what makes you happy and never stop dreaming. So, I think what's so powerful about The Best We Could Do is that it's not just, it's a very powerful story about Southeast Asian refugees that really probes, and challenges much of what the United States says about the war in Vietnam, about welcoming refugees, or the way that they're treated once they're here, and also how does a family deal with war? And that's a very challenging issue. But the way that she's done it really opens up, I think, a much bigger, more common experience of thinking about trauma in our families, and the challenges that many people face, whether they've been through war or not. The truth is, everyone is challenged by something, right? So that really is one of the key pieces to I think what makes this book so powerful. Is that it not only speaks to her experience, but I think it speaks to a much broader broader set of human experiences. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions, but also I just want to hear your thoughts too about the book, and things that really touched you or surprised you. I think those are always great things to share when we share a reading.
Thank you, Dr. Chang.